virtual program. We're virtual this year as last year. And we hope that next year we'll be back in person. It's a lot more, let's say, exciting and interactive on the in-person route. But we've learned that the Zoom versions, the virtual versions, can be very, very engaging as well. And a lot of those tricks you'll see coming up during the next 2 weeks. We deal in SISE with gigaton problems, so things that really matter. Historically, that is when we started 11 years ago, it was energy and a transition to sustainable forms of energy. Very important then as now. Now the emphasis is much more on climate change, and that's the driver for the transition to sustainable energy forms. Since about 2015, the interest in climate change has grown enormously. Part of that is due to the fact that there is severe weather that is caused by climate change, and we've seen that in the past year in many forms: wildfires in the West, Texas freeze in February of this year, heat waves in the Pacific Northwest, which never happen until they do. That is driving actually a much bigger gigaton problem. We emphasize critical thinking. There's a lot of information out there, especially on the web. Some of it is reliable, some of it is extraneous, but not exactly wrong, and some of it is exactly wrong. So we want to emphasize how to find our way and your way through all of this maze of information to find the stuff that matters. And that's a knack that all of us have found, and you will find, you fellows will find, very useful throughout the rest of your careers, social life, basically through every area of life, critical thinking. So with that intro, I think I will turn it over to Eric Vettel. For the last 2 years, we've been very, very happy and satisfied to have the American Energy Society, that's Eric Vettel and Katie McCune, who you will meet, as partners, and they have helped enormously in arranging the program and the projects. So, Eric?
There we go. Thank you, George. Thank you so much. So, yes, I am the president of the American Energy Society, a nonpartisan sector agnostic professional association that does not lobby. We don't play favorites, but we do have favorites. We enjoy working with you, George and Thomas, but I'll get to that in a second. Every energy expert has their preferred go-to sources. The American Energy Society, on the other hand, is the go-to supplemental resource. We offer an objective landscape view of the entire energy sector. Once upon a time, about when SISE started actually, it was relatively easy for an energy professional to keep an eye on the entire sector. Basically, it was oil and coal, upstream, downstream, offshore, onshore, metallurgical, and thermal. However, the energy solutions of today are far more complex and flexible and interchangeable. A constant, unrelenting, all of the above consideration: wind, wave, and solar, nuclear and natural gas, blue, gray, and green hydrogen, LNG and lithium, utility scale and off-grid storage, utilities and community choice, and it goes on. The energy matrix is so complicated that it is nearly impossible to keep track of the next new thing. That's where we come in. The American Energy Sector Society offers, in the words of Dan Yergin, situational awareness about the sector with a keen eye on tomorrow's energies today. We have about 135,000 members, friends, and readers. And if you aren't already, we hope you will join as a member. But at the very least, you should join as a friend for free at the end of the program, of course. It literally takes a minute to join as a member or friend. And then you have a subscription to our award-winning publications and many other benefits and services. We're very pleased to co-host this 11th annual SISE conference with our fearless leaders at the University of Illinois, Chicago, especially George Crabtree and Thomas Alon. True pleasures to work with. Creative, thoughtful, considerate, and dare I say, fun. I think I can speak for all of us at the American Energy Society. We really enjoy working together, and I think that joy will be apparent throughout this program. As always, at the center of SISE are the fellows. This year's SISE class consists of 33 extremely talented, brilliant early-stage energy professionals, but there are 10 years of brilliant SISE alumni too. I should also point out that SISE benefits enormously from the support of its sponsors and partners. We are grateful for their generosity, especially the Baum Family Fund, Wilson Sonsini, Electrify America, ORIC, the State of Green, and Innovation Center of Denmark in Silicon Valley. And finally, I want to thank and welcome all of the event attendees too. Through last night, we had 17,300 event attendees engaged with this conference, and we're just getting started. I worry about our sustainable energy future a lot. The challenges are extraordinary, but I am comforted by the fact that 17,300 people have already committed to participate in this event. And no doubt that total will continue to grow throughout the week. Correct me if I'm wrong, George and Thomas, but I think 17,300 is a SISE record. We'll keep a close watch. We'll report back. It is also my pleasure to welcome the keynote speaker for this year's SISE conference, Dr. Kimberley Miner. I can think of no one better to start us on our journey than Dr. Miner. Dr. Miner is not only a leading climate scientist, but also a wildfire fighter, a black belt in karate, a dog rescuer, considering an affiliation with JPL and NASA, maybe a rocket scientist too. It's really impressive CV, but there's something not listed that is more important than all of these experiences, especially for a climate scientist. Dr. Miner is honest. She will speak the truth without hesitation, without qualification. Many people, most people don't want to hear the truth about the climate because the truth is upsetting. The truth requires courage, conviction, strength, honesty. Dr. Miner is all of these, and she will offer an honest assessment of energy and the environment, where we are and where we're going. The rest of the conference will be solutions oriented. We will hear speakers from a wide variety of fields from all the sectors, venture capital and architecture, policy advisors and Forbes 30 under 30 investors, Uber about transportation, Honeywell about industry, manufacturing, and agriculture too. On Friday, we will also unveil a new energy ecosystem map of Denmark. You won't want to miss that special ceremony. But before we consider solutions to our great gigaton challenges, we have to start from an honest base. Indeed, our SISE fellows were selected because they have the courage to hear what you have to say. Dr. Miner, we will hear you. Dr. Miner.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, Eric. I'm just delighted to be here with everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and it's going to be just one moment while I switch into the presentation mode. All right, how are we doing, Eric? Can you see my presentation? Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you. As Eric mentioned, we are going to be talking about some challenging topics this morning, but I think they're going to be important for us to get a handle on. And I've left a lot of time for Q&A at the end. So I'm happy to stick around and we can discuss. Today, we'll be talking about climate tipping points and how they impact ecosystems and energy ecosystems both. So this is a graphic from a colleague of mine in Europe, and he has done an amazing job of visualizing some of the data that we have around climate change and just day-to-day, year-to-year heating. So earlier on in the graphic, on the left side of the graphic, you can see the relatively stable cooler temperatures moving to the right with the relatively warmer temperatures. And we are all aware that changes abound. There's a lot of things, as Eric and George both mentioned, that are happening day to day now that are reflecting new climate normal, or as Catherine Hayhoe calls it, climate weirding. But it's important for us to talk about some of the most cutting edge topics in climate science and not just stay in the normal conversation that you're going to see on CNN or another news media that's having to cover the more median conversation. So we're going to talk about tipping points. But let's back up a little bit. So we're going to mostly focus on the Arctic today because the Arctic is emblematic of a tipping point ecosystem, but it's also really interesting and fun to talk about. Now, I've done some work in the Arctic, and when you say that you've worked in the Arctic, you know, it's generally cool. Sometimes you get to go to a hot spring. We've got some nice breweries up in Alaska. But what it actually means is that you sometimes get stuck in an 8-day blizzard on a glacier. You can see on the far left, this is my tent. It was the first one to go when the blizzard started because I had dug the hole so deep to protect myself from the wind that the snow filled it up right away. We ended up shoveling every hour to try and make sure that those tents didn't get permanently covered by snow. And sometimes when it's dark at night, I still wake up thinking that I'm buried in a snow cave. So it can be pretty exciting to work in the Arctic. This is a map of where we were on the glacier. And we found some really neat stuff. I'm not going to go into it today, but if you want to talk about what we found in the Q&A, I'm happy to do so. Now, the crew of the HMS Terror found similarly that the Arctic is exciting and difficult to work in. So this is actually a quote from June 5th. So last month, right? Weary of being mired in ice, we abandoned ship and began making our way back to Fish River. Hence, we hope to England's green and pleasant land. So the takeaway from this is that on June 5th, 1847, so a little over 100 years ago, they were mired in ice in the middle of the summer. No way to get out. They ended up having to abandon ship. It's an infamous story. It's not a very nice story, but the crew was lost and they were not able to recover the ship until 2015. And in the summer of 2015, June through August, the Arctic Ocean was completely ice-free in this part of the Victoria Strait. And you can see this is actually the HMS Terror right there. You can see all the way down. It looks like the Caribbean Ocean, beautiful and clear and translucent and no longer mired in ice, only 160 years later. And as I'm sure you all have begun to notice, and I'm noticing, you can see year over year changes these days. We're starting to see changes on the scale of 1, 2, 5, 10 years. And though that's not necessarily data-driven observations, all of these observations are important to us understanding what's going on with climate change. So let's get back to tipping points. What is a tipping point? So a tipping point is a threshold. Once you cross a tipping point, it means that the ecosystem has changed so irrevocably, it's going to be very difficult for us to get back. And that may mean, I'm going to give you a bunch of examples from the Arctic, but that may mean that things grow differently. It may mean that you have different precipitation patterns. It may mean that the ice doesn't regrow, that you're not getting new ice every year. And what ends up happening is that the changes become unstoppable. They build upon themselves. And it's often described as a snowball rolling downhill. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger and grander and grander. We may have to actually change that analogy now that we're having so many problems keeping our snow year to year. But the idea is that once you cross a tipping point in an ecosystem, that ecosystem is changed forever. So small disturbances, things that are, again, year-to-year changes, wildfires, precipitation changes, non-accumulating snow and ice, these can lead to tipping points. And let's get into some very concrete examples from the Arctic. So this is a video. Let's see if we can get this to go. There we go. Okay, so this is from NOAA. And as you can see, we're going to watch the Arctic sea ice shrink and get lost between 1990 and just before present day. So the white ice is the oldest ice and the blue ice is the youngest ice. So what it means if we lose the white ice is that unless we have 9 years of consistent cold temperatures that allow for that ice to regrow, we will not have this legacy ice. We will only be able to get this year-to-year ice, the 1-year ice, and maybe even the 2-year ice. And that leads to instability in the Arctic Ocean. You've seen a lot of memes, I'm sure, with polar bears. It leads to an instability for the apex predators, all the way down to the microorganisms that live in this ecosystem. And what that does is it starts to move across the system and impact many, many things, even outside of the Arctic Ocean. Another example that I've been talking a lot about recently is permafrost. So permafrost is frozen soil, and it can be up to 1 million years old. Some of the deepest permafrost has 90% ice. It's called eudoma, and that's some of the stuff that's up to 1 million years old. And it can be everything from detritus to microorganisms. So all sorts of different kinds of carbon, like think dead things. So dead grasses, dead animals, all compacted into this kind of sludgy mud, and then it's frozen. Well, because there's a lot of detritus or things that are deteriorating in the mud, what that means is that you end up having carbon released into the environment as it thaws. That can be in the form of CO2 or methane. And so as this thaws, there is concern that the carbon is going to be released into the atmosphere and speed up the dynamics that are already going on with the carbon sequestration, the carbon buildup in the atmosphere from climate change. So this is another thing that we're tracking, but it's also emblematic of something that cannot regrow. If you think that this soil has been frozen for 1 million years, it's going to be very difficult for us to refreeze it, especially in 1 to 2 year time periods. This is just an image. This was actually done by the New York Times. They have an absolutely gorgeous image base. And this is a rapid thawing permafrost versus gradual thawing permafrost. And you can see around the Arctic Ocean, where the temperatures are often warmest, and we'll get into that in just a moment, you're seeing rapid thaw, so just complete degradation and fall of permafrost, where you get these giant holes that you may have seen in images, or just areas of complete collapse, and it turns into wetlands, or it turns into a hole, and you're not going to be able to get that permafrost back, which is a lot of the stability for the soil. And as I just mentioned, the polar magnification of these temperatures has been in the news recently. This is from, goodness, 4 days ago, I think, 118 degrees Fahrenheit near the Arctic Circle. So the areas where the permafrost is most vulnerable, the areas that are most important, these are all kind of coalescing near the Arctic Ocean, where the temperatures are also the warmest. 118 degrees for the Arctic Circle is absolutely insane. I know that I was very, very uncomfortable when I saw this, as were a lot of people. So this is emblematic of a tipping point. This is an indication, hey, something is going on, time to pay attention, time to do something. All of these factors, these are all just symptoms of something that we are tracking to see if it's actually going to be a total change in ecosystem. And the inability of the sea ice to regrow, the inability of the permafrost to stabilize, and now these warm temperatures that promise to make it difficult to have year over year ice growth are all emblematic of what we might consider a tipping point. So what happens when these tipping points expand? This is a graphic that it was actually kind of funny. Vice put that they were scientists, and so they can't also be expected to be artists. I thought this was a lovely graphic, but Vice disagreed. So Linton et al. In 2008 shared what would happen when tipping points expand. If you've got melt of Greenland ice sheet and the deep Atlantic water formation, I'm sure you've all heard about the way that ocean circulation is changing. But then you're meeting it with the boreal forest dieback, with the Amazon rainforest dieback, with the Sahara changing. So all of these tipping points are starting to expand into each other. And it's possible that the planet is heading towards a large scale tipping point where many ecosystems will change at the same time, or very, very quickly in rapid succession. And disasters speed up these changes. So when I'm talking about disasters, I'm talking about the Arctic literally burning, okay? Areas that used to be frozen, whether it was permafrost or above ground ice, are now burning in the summer. And that includes what we're calling zombie fires, which are below ground fires that burn year to year. And so the material that used to be frozen, the detritus and the permafrost that used to be frozen, is now dry enough that it's able to burn. And when this happens, you have even more rapid changes and even more tipping points that are crossed, because you have essential ecosystem instability. And that's also true for human land cover change. You can imagine if you take a boreal forest and you raise it and build apartment buildings, you have a change that will not be recoverable, at least in one generation and maybe ever. So the question, and what I want to get into with you all, is, do we even notice? And if we do notice, how do we notice? So I'd like to present to you some of the trends, some of the opportunities, even in the mass media, to notice what's going on in ecosystems and put them into our own thinking. Kind of like Eric and George were talking about with critical thinking, the best way to recognize patterns is to do it across all media, to look at all the different kinds of reporting, how is it being represented in movies? How is it being represented in the peer-reviewed journals? And that's how we start to understand what's going on. That's how we start to notice our environment before we are the metaphorical frog in boiling water. So some of the trends that I suggest that you watch for in the news include terminology like first ever, lowest, or highest. Now, here are some just from very recently. These have already been mentioned, but I know it's on all of our minds. These heat waves that are happening in the Pacific Northwest and in Canada. We've seen that a lot of people have passed away from heat stress, which is actually quite common in other parts of the world and not as common in the Pacific Northwest. But you can see shatters as a big word on that, soared to 116 degrees. These are all indications that a trend is forming. Just like when you're doing any kind of trend analysis for energy sector or for Wall Street, this is the same kind of thing that you're going to be able to do to start indicating you should go look at something further. Florida Keys faces stark reality. Water is coming as seas rise. Greenland is melting at some of the fastest rates in 12,000 years. Again, indicating that there's a trend forming, things are changing. Unseasonal hailstorms continue to inflict mass crop damage. So anything that's indicating, hey, this is the way that things used to go, and then we've reached a point at which a new trend is forming, there's a new analysis that needs to be done. That's what I'm suggesting that you look for when we're looking for and we're scoping out these tipping points in ecosystems and in the energy sector. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a rundown, what folks in the scientific community are watching, what we are interested in, and what needs to be monitored to see if we are approaching tipping points across a variety of scales. So let's start with ecosystem services. The availability of fresh water has been a growing concern, and it is a huge topic of conversation in the West as we speak. And you can see from this map that the water withdrawal percentage total of available water, so how much water can you take out of what water is available, is decreasing. And that's definitely true as we lose our glaciers and ice storage as well, because that's kind of the cooler for our water. That's our fridge. And without that storage of water, it's going to be hard to have year over year precipitation fill the gap. Soil quality and density is also something that we're losing. And I apologize for the clarity of this map. Hopefully you can see it well enough. The take home of it is that the land degradation, so the stability of soil, the ability of soil to grow things, is going down. And as we push the soil further and further to generate more crops, as we deforest and change the land cover, you're going to see more and more land degradation and less ability to preserve our farmlands and other types of soil that are essential for ecosystem services. Biodiversity is also a huge topic. These are both from peer-reviewed publications, so they're a little bit dense, but the take home is that biodiversity across strata, so from soil microbes all the way up to, let's say, trees and predators, is changing and maybe being impacted. There's talk about whether or not there's a huge die-off going on across all different scales. So this is a very important topic that we are discussing. And obviously with any tipping point, like in the Arctic, you're going to see a biodiversity loss because the temperatures in which an ecosystem has evolved are not the temperatures that we're currently seeing. And this is a little bit of self-aggrandizement. This is a study that we did on Mount Everest, indicating that there were microplastics at the top of Mount Everest, much higher than we were hoping to find. And so this brings us back to pollution, and specifically plastic pollution being a huge, huge problem. And if you think about it, there's actually one common source for a lot of these types of pollution, whether you're dumping CO2 into the air or you're dumping plastic into the water. They're all made of the same base material. And so there needs to be a conversation about that and a conversation about next steps. All right, I'm going to just briefly touch on energy since that's what a lot of folks here are specialists in. You can see on the right-hand side, this is one of the Bloomberg tickers, and they have updated their portfolio to talk about what's going on in the environment and in climate, as well as what's going on in the energy sector. That to me is an indication of the beginnings of an energy transition, a true energy transition, where we are able to change and discuss the way that we use and produce energy. One of the interesting things that I've been tracking for a number of years, I actually had a professor at Columbia who worked on this project, is carbon sequestration. Now, this one's very neat. The idea basically, and we can talk about it more if folks have questions, is that they would be able to introduce CO2 or inject CO2 into basalt and trap it permanently in rocks. And there has been some success in the northern latitudes. I believe the biggest project is in Iceland doing this transition, but it is a big process to take the CO2 out of the atmosphere. It's very challenging to scavenge CO2 from the atmosphere. So this is not a Hail Mary, but it is an interesting thing that I'm definitely watching. And geoengineering is an ongoing topic of conversation. I think it's the solution that no one wants to use and no one really wants to talk about. I have a number of colleagues who are specialists in geoengineering simply because they want to understand how safe it is. So the idea basically is that we would do something to the environment, whether it's seeding the ocean to grow more algae so that it can absorb more CO2, or in this example, putting mirrors on the outside of the atmosphere to reflect the sun. The idea is that we would somehow change the environment to lower the temperature. Now, the externalities of this could be significant. If you think about what happened in Hawaii, Captain Cook brought rats, and so then cats were imported to deal with the rats. The cats killed the birds, so they brought in dogs to kill the cats, and it ends up being this endless cycle of we're trying to modify the environment, but we don't really understand it well enough to do it successfully. Okay, moving on to infrastructure. So we were talking a little bit about permafrost, and this is what it looks like functionally. So loss of roads, there's these things called drunken telephone poles that you can see when you're driving across the permafrost environment, and they're leaning almost at a 90-degree angle because the permafrost is thawing and it ends up being this kind of soupy mess, and you lose whatever infrastructure, whether they fall over or they degrade, that is on top of the permafrost. So this is a problem for the northern latitudes, but permafrost covers 25% of the land surface of the planet. So it's actually kind of a big problem for everybody. The cold and warm snaps that Eric referenced are an ongoing dynamic, and I'm happy to discuss exactly what's happening. But basically, as we change the thermal and chemical characteristics of the atmosphere, we have different types of wind patterns, just to make it really straightforward. And that kind of changes the way that things are flowing. So this idea of the polar vortex coming down, it's coming down lower and lower. And it's because there's different types of dynamics in the northern hemisphere than there used to be. So we don't have the kind of blocking that we used to have, where you've got a warmer lower 48 and a colder upper Canada and Alaska region. So again, happy to discuss that further, but this is probably something that we're going to be seeing more. Now, drinking water contamination is also an ongoing issue, and there's a couple different things driving this. In Flint, obviously, it was because of an infrastructure issue and a change of water source that led to lead degradation of the pipes. But as we are using less and less ideal water sources, because we are seeing more and more drought. So we're not using reservoirs, we're using different kinds of groundwater, we're getting them from deeper and deeper aquifers. We have the potential to see greater drinking water contamination, as well as an availability shortage. Now, mass transit is something that's been in the news a little bit, and then this could be something that we head towards. And again, the rapidity is the issue. How quickly are we heading towards mass transit, and at what scale is it going to be useful? We also did see last year, though, under COVID-19, that almost the entire world stopped driving and stopped flying. And it was only a small blip on the radar of carbon loss, and we were able to make that up very quickly with the footprint going straight up, the carbon CO2 concentration in the atmosphere going straight up after lockdown. So there is some indication that it has to be more collective and less individual, but mass transit is an absolutely great step in the right direction. So storms and disasters, Eric also referenced. And we talked about the prolonged fire season and zombie fires. I think basically the whole world is watching this. So this is not unique to scientists. We are, however, trying to understand things like the leaf moisture content and how much fuel is available and what that means for, again, year-over-year fire growth. Is it possible to have a fire in the same place twice? That was something that was not as common before, and maybe it's more common now. So hurricane season technically just started very early. We're, I think, a month early, actually, maybe even 2 months early for this year. But this was from 2020. This was the greatest number of hurricanes we'd ever seen. I don't know if folks remember, but back when we were all younger, 1 to 2 hurricanes was considered, a pretty reasonable hurricane season. And look at this graphic from 2020. So it's really changing the ecosystem, and it's going to make it difficult for all different types of animals, plants, humans, infrastructure to succeed in this part of the world that's being hit every single year with these very strong hurricanes. Now, this is a graphic or an image that's near and dear to my heart. This was from Hurricane Sandy. I was actually in New York during Hurricane Sandy and joined the Office of Emergency Management to help out right afterwards. So sea level rise and specifically storm surge. So gradual sea level rise that when we then have a huge storm, whether it is, a regular big thunderstorm, whether it is a hurricane, that the sea level has risen enough that there's then inundation from this storm. And it's almost like a magnifying effect. And you're seeing this, again, all the time. And in Alexandria, where we used to live, there was a measurement on the building of how high the water had gotten in the downtown area. And every year you were seeing new stripes on where the water had gotten that year. And a lot of this is driven by a loss of ice. So another thing that I'm hoping you're all aware of is Antarctica and the way that the ice is flowing, especially on the Western Antarctic ice sheet. I think I've lost my mouse, but you can kind of see where the red is right there, the Western Antarctic ice sheet, and whether or not it's stable, whether or not we're going to be losing huge, huge masses of ice that then is going to gradually melt into the sea. And we'll see sea level rise from that. There's a lot of external issues around that as well that have to do with salinity and the circulation of the ocean. But for our purposes, it's just important to be aware of what's going on and how that's going to impact our day-to-day lives and ecosystems and whether or not they're stable over time. Okay. So that's a lot. It's a lot to think about. I yesterday implemented in our family a climate change free day where we're not allowed to think about our research or talk about climate change. I'm hoping that it helps a little bit with our peace of mind, but it's a lot of things for us all to think and work around and talk about. So what I want to do is present one option for how we are addressing it, but then open it up to as many questions as we have time for, and we can move this into a broader discussion with all of you wonderful fellows about what next steps look like, what the implications of this are, and what this feels like for us in the day-to-day. So this is a very exciting thing that has just happened for me and for a number of folks at NASA. We have just been given the go-ahead for a new Earth Systems Observatory. And basically what this is going to look like is a first ever virtual constellation Okay, so not like what Elon Musk is doing, but a virtual constellation of satellites from NASA, from the European Space Agency, and from the Indian Space Agency so far, where we're going to look at everything that's going on across the planet at the finest scale we've ever had. So what is the hydrology looking like and how is it changing? What is the land cover looking like and how is that changing? What about earthquakes? What about sea level rise? What about total leaf cover? And I've been describing it like the HMS Beagle when Darwin set out and observed evolution and was able to write it down for the general European masses for the first time. This is going to be the opportunity for us to understand what's going on with the Earth system, and what you can measure, you can manage, and what you can love, you can preserve. So it is my dear hope that the more we can understand the ecosystem and what's going on around us with this, among other new initiatives, we're going to be able to better understand our part in it, how to preserve it, and how to move forward. The technology of humans has been incredible, and it's sped up so rapidly. 100 years ago, we were learning to fly. 60 years ago, we were on the moon. It's incredible. So what we need to do now is understand our place in the earth, not just our place in the cosmos, and how that impacts ourselves, the world around us, and future generations. And on that note, we will turn to Carl Sagan. I will not read you the quote, mostly because there's a bunch of stuff sitting on my screen. But the take home is our posturing, our imagined self-importance, and the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe are all challenged by this point of pale blue light. So as we move into questions and answers, let's just remember, we're all doing this together. We're all on the same planet. This is the only one we found so far that's habitable. Can you imagine living on Mars? You can't breathe the air. There's no water. The gravity's messed up. The atmosphere makes it so hot or so cold. It would be a real challenge. So it would be much better if we could just stay where we are and stay here on Earth successfully and together. Thank you.
Wow. Okay, Dr. Miner, thank you. It's funny, I spent much of the weekend and last night putting together questions. Now I realize I didn't have to. We got a lot of questions, by the way, and I think Jennifer, one of the fellows, said climate anxiety is real. So I think that captures a lot of how many people feel. So if you have questions from Twitter, questions from YouTube, but obviously, of course, we're going to honor the questions from the fellows most of all. I'll try and go through them. Some of them have to do with some of the tipping points that you've noticed, the phenomena. Rebecca and Utsavi, and I apologize to the fellows if I mispronounce your names. After a week or two, we'll get it right. I apologize in advance, though. Rebecca and Utsavi, one wanted to know what happens if all the permafrost melts. Utsavi wants to know more about these zombie wildfires. I mean, what is the relationship between climate change and the cause? What is that about? Some wanted to know more about you, Dr. Miner. Some wanted to know if you got to the top of Mount Everest too. Angie asked a really interesting, and by the way, Sam, let's see, Sam, Sebastian, and Fizz and others wanted to talk about capitalism. And I'm going to put those questions to the next panel because that's where we talk about systems thinking, if you don't mind, Dr. Miner. But we're not going to bypass those. Angie had a really interesting question I'd like to start, and then we can go back to some of these others. Angie said, you recommend building infrastructure like mass transit in cities, and that is a one potential solution. But Angie wants to know, but are they being built in the context of the changing climate? Do we fully appreciate and understand how the climate is changing so that we can build the infrastructure and the mass transit so that it is appropriate for the new climate that we don't yet appreciate? Does that question make sense, Dr. Meyer?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I want to clarify, I am not recommending building infrastructure or anything else, but I do I think it's interesting what's going on for mass transit. And I don't know whether or not the folks who are building out or retrofitting mass transit are incorporating climate. I just hosted a talk with some folks from OSTP, from the White House, and they have put together an amazing panel, an amazing office, multiple offices now of experts who are experts in dynamics across the climate sector. So everything from energy to building to ecosystem experts. So I think that there's some indications that there's a lot of really great thinkers working on these problems at the high level in the US. And that makes me feel comforted.
Good, okay. We have a couple questions that overlap. One from the delayed feed from Al Hackford in East Aurora, but also a fellow from one of our fellows, Anya. They asked about priorities, and I raised this question because I noticed that there's in the chat feed, there's a lot of questions about electric vehicles, but I want to broaden that question. Both Al and Anya are asking about priorities. Should we be focusing our decarbonization efforts on one sector at a time, industry, manufacturing, agriculture, transportation, or power generation? If so, which one? Because there's a lot of talk about electric vehicles, is that enough? Or should we be talking about all these sectors to try to get ahead of the emissions and decarbonize?
So I want to actually take that question and take it back out to the big perspective. When we're talking about priorities, I actually take a little bit of a Teddy Roosevelt perspective on this. I think the number one priority for humanity needs to be to trust in the natural processes, and what that looks like functionally is preserving wild spaces. So these groups that are talking about preserving 30% of the planet for wilderness, or more, I think personally, I believe that should be our number one priority. And then things can fall in line from there. As far as decarbonization goes, unfortunately, I'm not as big of an expert on which thing we should do first, whether or not, it is electric cars or whether or not it is common energy infrastructure. But what I do know is that we have a beautiful, structurally sound ecosystem all around us. So if we could work more closely with those systems, or at least let them be until we understand how to be a better integrated piece of it, I think that would be a good next step.
By the way, it was Chaitanya. Sorry, Chaitanya. Sorry about that. Thank you, Dr. Wayne. So let's back up to some of the original ones. What happens if all the permafrost melts? What happens?
Okay. So permafrost is challenging because we're still working on developing models that really capture all the dynamics of what's going on with the permafrost, because there's so many different, years, there's so many years of aggregation, of accumulation, and so many different dynamics happening with thaw. We're still really trying to capture that. If all the permafrost on Earth thawed, I don't even know. It would be the absolute worst case scenario you could possibly imagine. We're talking about 2100 right now in the models for reference, if this were to happen, and ideally it will not. But these pulses of carbon into the atmosphere, so CO2 and methane release, would potentially impact the global carbon cycle and make the atmosphere warmer quickly. But then I also have a paper in review right now where we've talked about all the nuclear assets that are stored in the permafrost, all the weapons that were tested in the permafrost, all the mercury that's in the permafrost, all the DDT that's stored in glaciers, and how all of that would be released into the atmosphere and into the ecosystem with melt and thaw. So there are levels of bad around permafrost thaw, and it starts at, well, that's a bummer about the infrastructure. That's really hard. And it gets significantly worse from there, again, in my perspective.
Yeah, that's a great, thank you. I saw a projection. They said, this is what happens when sea levels rise 10 feet. I'm thinking that's a little too late. 10 feet, what's the difference between 10 and 9 feet? I think you're frogged in boiling water. Utsavi, zombie wildfires, we have a lot of questions coming in. Can you explain a little bit more about what these zombie wildfires are?
Sure. So it's a really great example of good science communication, right? There's this wildfire and it's kind of interesting, but then they put zombie in front of it and now it's really interesting. So basically the idea is that there are fires that are happening outside of the fire season. And when you track them and you try to figure out how they're starting, it turns out it is a fire from the previous year's fire season that has either gone underground or is smoldering just below the surface. And it has enough material so that it can stay year over year and just keep burning. So it ends up being able to spark wildfires outside of the fire season. So in April, in March, and you end up having a longer and longer fire season and fires that are happening, under the ground. And again, destabilizing the permafrost, releasing carbon, releasing, all the nasty stuff that fires release. So that's what we're talking about when we say zombie wildfires. I believe it's mostly something that we're talking about in the Arctic, because the soil is frozen, so it ends up creating kind of a layer for the zombie wildfires to tunnel underneath. And a lot of this is non-specific language, so it doesn't actually tunnel, okay? I'm trying to give you guys an understanding of what it looks like using some of these more common terms. Thank you.
So a question from a fellow from last year, Sam Chazen, year 10, SISE year 10. You said that, he says, you said, and I 118 degrees is a symptom. He said, when does a symptom become a tipping point?
Okay, so tipping points are the accumulation, conglomeration of a bunch of different things that are all happening in one location. And because all of these things that have happened, it makes it very difficult for the ecosystem to be stable or to go back to where it was. Okay, so let's talk about glaciers. So in Washington, I was just reading about this yesterday. In Washington, there's this heat dynamic going on. Okay, so that's a symptom of a tipping point in the ecosystem. What that does is that thaws these glaciers that have taken hundreds of years to form. And that is another symptom. But because of all of these things accumulating, we are not going to be able to regrow the glaciers because it's warmer now than it was back when the glaciers grew. And so we're going to be having a lot of trouble with year over year ice growth, which means we will not regain the glacier ecosystem. So the whole hydrology, all of the water that's dependent on there being glaciers and glacier melt every year changes, goes away. Okay. So basically the tipping point then is indicated by a bunch of different things that happen at the same time and make it so that the ecosystem is inherently different than it's been in our recent human time frame.
All right. Henrietta, are you there, Henrietta? You have a question. I thought, what a great question. Can you ask Dr. Miner that question that you just posted?
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Meyer. That was an exciting presentation. I hope we can see your PowerPoint. My question is a very simple one. You presented so many ideas, so many things that have been done during, at least from the baby generation up. My question is, what do you think is the lowest hanging fruit that we should consider focusing on? Thank you.
Thanks, Henrietta. I would just reiterate that I think that it's wild land preservation, reforesting, regrowth, whether that's the Amazon or that's in northern North America. I think that it's really important to keep as much land wild as we can during all of these transitions and while humans are trying to figure ourselves out. On the very local scale, there's always things that we can do. In Los Angeles, for example, there's a lovely nonprofit called Tree People, and they plant trees all across LA. And it's urban trees, it's trees in the forests, and it's a nice thing to do on a weekend. So I think there's a lot of different ways to integrate this into your daily life, but I think ecosystem thinking, putting ecosystems first, whether that's putting a bowl of water out for the birds during a heat wave, or whether that's keeping wildlands wild. I think for me, that's what I'm trying to focus on. It's a positive direction.
Ashley, you had a great question. You want to know more about the NASA study. Ashley, can you ask you had a really interesting question about some of Dr. Miner's research?
Sure, yes. So my question was about the new NASA system that her team was working on. she was able to talk a little bit about how it's able to read about like leaf, the amount of leaf cover on the earth, and about hydrogen levels. And I just was curious about how the system was able to do that and what it's using to read those levels on the earth.
Sorry, you said hydrogen levels, Ashley?
I think that's what you had said. I wasn't sure. It was going pretty fast.
Sure. Yeah, let me just take a step back. So the Earth Systems Observatory is basically a conglomeration of a bunch of satellites that are put out by a bunch of different space agencies, focusing on different things. Leaf area index is something that we are already able to see. But the idea is that we would be able to scale things down to smaller pixel sizes. So remember, these things are in space, so it is kind of far away. And so being able to see, leaves or groups of leaves or the output from leaves is always a really special thing. And if we can continue to scale it down, all the better. We do have a number of satellites already that look at some of these things. As far as hydrogen goes, I think my interest is mostly in hydrogen to oxygen. I mean, otherwise I'm not sure about what we're monitoring for that. So that might have been me misspeaking.
Thank you so
Utsavi
much.
and Mesra have, Mirsa, sorry, and Utsavi have been having a go back and forth. Really interesting comments about the challenges to the electric grid and this electrification of everything. I think that, I forgot who it was, it was Jennifer who had climate anxiety is what she said. But when I'm seeing this back and forth in the question between outages, wildfires, outages, and the electrification of everything. Want to know if you could go there, Dr. Miner, because we do have panels that will be addressing that. That's, but I wanted to know if you had any thoughts on how do you offset that, or are you more focused on perhaps the wildlands, as you mentioned? Jennifer Coronel has asked more about the wildlands and how do we protect those. Which ones would you focus on?
So for the electricity question, the question is, I'm sorry, how to offset electricity? I don't understand.
The outages. Mersa, are you there?
So we were kind of talking in the chat, like we were talking about this whole shift and transition to all electric powered buses. Like someone was talking, even their school buses is going electric. And it was always a thought of mine, if something like Sandy storm happens and we have this mass outage, what's the solution for that? Because it's obviously going there, but have anyone thinking of those type of concerns? Is that something that you're working on, or you read any articles about it?
I guess I'm not clear what the difference would be. So we still have an electric grid right now, right? We still built out all this infrastructure in this little envelope that humans are comfortable living in. What would be the difference if we're electrifying things? I guess some of the buses wouldn't be on gas anymore. Is that the concern?
I guess it's more of like a trust. Like for me, if in my household, if I want to have a car, I would have an electric one and I would have a gasoline one just to make sure if something happens. And if there is a power outage, I still have another alternative. So it's still that trust thing. Like, has there been any work on the trust of citizens to say, oh, I can like fully go there and trust the system. They're working on it. Stuff like that. I think that's more of a bigger scope that's coming in future, but we are not 100% electric, whereas that's the target for us.
Yeah, I really don't focus on any of these issues, but I think that, if we were to talk about climate communication or science communication, I think trust is always an issue. It's something that scientists have been working on, figuring out how to gain trust, how to communicate in ways that people understand for generations. And I guess as far as electricity outages go, I think it's the same thing as any kind of loss to our food system, to our water system. Basically, we have evolved to be very comfortable within a certain range of dynamics, temperatures, precipitation types, and that is changing. So there will probably be challenges inherent within them, regardless of what system you use. If you have a gas-powered car and there's a flood and you can't drive your gas-powered car, it really doesn't matter if it's gas or electric. So I think the issue is not whether or not electric is as reliable. I think the issue is, how do we live within a changing system? And how do we do that best? How do we troubleshoot these things before they arise, regardless of what type of energy we're talking about, what type of infrastructure we're talking about? We're going to have to troubleshoot everything to make sure that we're understanding all the different potential futures, just like we used to, but now we're incorporating atmospheric and climate dynamics in a way that I think we really haven't in previous generations.
Question about communication that came in from the delayed feed. Wade Talkington from Incline Village wants to know, how do I respond to someone who points out that the Earth naturally goes through warming and cooling epochs, and there really isn't much that we can do about that? How would you respond to that comment, Dr. Meyer?
It's sad because I hear this a lot, and a lot of this is based on a misunderstanding of the GISP ice core, the Greenland ice sheet ice core. So basically, the world has gone through different warming and cooling periods. Not so much within humans' lifespan, which is kind of the challenge, right? But the rate is the issue. So whereas something used to take hundreds of years or thousands of years to change, now it's taking one generation, 10 years for us to see remarkable differences. And that rate is totally different than anything you can see on the ice core records, on the tree ring records, on any of the records that we have that have gone through time. And that's what we're really trying to address. That's also our indication that something is different in the system. And then, it's very, very basic physics. And I hesitate, but I always have to share with people, this is very basic physics. This is not complicated. This is not challenging. This is basic. When you put something that captures heat into somewhere else, it captures heat. That's it. So if you're going to follow the lines, it gives you a bunch of different information and background that then you can use to explain. Catherine Hayhoe just put out a really lovely article about the challenges or futilities of trying to negotiate with folks who believe things that aren't true in science. So, it's also up to you as an individual. Is this a good use of your time? Is this a good use of your resources? Do you want to try to argue with someone who doesn't understand physics? You don't have to.
Basic physics.
Yeah.
Alexandra had a great question about positive tipping points. Alexandra, are you there?
Yeah, so I've been reading about triggering positive tipping points that could help reduce natural tipping points. These are though more societal, so tipping points as in changing behavior and not reversing. So I think one of the examples was a community that is now being financially encouraged to help conservation. And the financial encouragement is to trigger this tipping point. So they help them financially first to do this conservation. And then they saw the positive impact it had in the community and with the agricultural land. So then they lowered the financial encouragement, and the community still did the conservational work. So could those type of triggering societal tipping points help reduce natural tipping points? Maybe.
Thanks, Alexandra. And I love your painting. That's so cool. I'm glad you asked a question. So I am using a framework, and I think a lot of these conversations borrow from frameworks that are socioeconomic, and we're kind of originally part of a more econometric framework. So yes, the word tipping point, I think, applies very beautifully to both. And there is a lot of conversation around tipping points right now for both the energy transition, what it looks like when folks accept climate change and science is something we need to deal with, integrating these conversations into just common parlance. So I think it is very similar, and there are potentially positive tipping points in, like you're saying, societal frameworks and socioeconomic frameworks that we can work towards. So the idea basically is a tipping point is just when something just changes, right? You were over here and now you're over here, and it can be applied to a lot of different areas. And you're absolutely right that I love the idea that socioeconomic positive tipping points could eventually lead to mitigating negative ecosystem tipping points. We're getting a little hand wavy at that point, but it is absolutely true that you can use this phraseology for both, and it really describes very similar dynamics.
We had a question from, I think, Ashwa. Is that right, Ashwa? Are you there? The questions are coming in so fast. I follow the question halfway through and then it gets pushed down. Is it Ashwa about the research that Dr. Miner's been conducting? Are you there?
Yeah. I was wondering, just a quick question on, like, as the world urbanizes, do you think this allows, like, and people like condense into one area? Do you think this allows for a larger, like, land area for societies to expand habitat restoration and biodiversity?
Oh, interesting idea. Okay, so two things I think about urbanization. One, if we condense and use up less land, I think there is more land for other stuff. Absolutely great point. But then I think that we're also talking about some very interesting dynamics around urbanization recently. How do we make cities more livable for humans? What does it look like to integrate more green? What does it look like to integrate more vertical food systems, for example? And how does that make things nicer, better, friendlier? And I think that if we're able to integrate some of these very cool design topics and areas into our urban cities more and more, as we get a little bit smarter about how ecosystems work and what humans like, I think there's a lot of potential for growth there as well. So I guess both things that you mentioned are absolutely correct in my estimation. And there's a lot of really good movement and trajectory in that way. Because I mean, I would like to have an urban forest outside my window as opposed to, a street with somebody honking. So I think there's a lot of movement in that direction.
Jennifer, you're going to get to ask the last question. I kind of started off with the climate anxiety question, and I thought that would be a nice back and forth with Dr. Miner, if you don't mind. Then we'll get ready for the next panel. But Jennifer, can you ask your question about your climate? What does climate anxiety mean to you? What do you mean when you reference that?
Well, I'm sure it's something we've all experienced, but when I hear all about these things, and especially because I did like environmental science in my undergrad, it's such a like nihilistic major, because you hear about all these things and then they tell you like, oh, there's not much we can do about it. I was actually talking about it with my little brother this weekend, and then he got bummed out for like the rest of the day because we talked about it. But maybe just my question for Professor is, like, this is your career, this is your field. How do you still stay positive? Because sometimes I hear about this stuff and I just get so overwhelmed. And then I get kind of sad, I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up. So I, again, was talking about this with my family yesterday when we decided to have a climate change free days. I also get really overwhelmed and sad, and it's really hard to do this every single day, but I can't imagine doing anything else right now. As far as I'm concerned, this is the most important thing I could possibly be doing. I am absolutely in love with the planet. If they offered me a trip to the moon or to Mars, I would say, thank you so much for offering, but no, thank you. I love this planet and I will be staying here. And so I am going to do everything in my power to make it a safe and healthy place for all the different organisms that live here to continue doing so. And we have this opportunity in our generation and in the next generation to make potentially the biggest difference ever for humanity. We have the potential to really change the trajectory of humans for the rest of time. And we can choose to do that. And so I am not scared, even though sometimes I'm sad, because I want to be a part of something big. I want to be a part of this huge change. And I want to be someone that my grandchildren or my niece and nephew grandchildren can look back on and say, yeah, she was incredible. I'm proud of everything she did. She did this, and then she did that, and then she did this, and it was really hard. And if you look back, especially through American history, we have a lot of different challenging times in American history where individuals have come together and really changed things. And I would argue they've often changed things for the better. And so I would rather be a figure who did something positive, even though it's hard, and even though it's exhausting, and even though every day it's a challenge, than someone who kind of just let it go, and hung out online and pretended it wasn't happening because it was scary. In our family, we do hard things, and that's what I'm trying to do, is do a hard thing. And that's what I know all of you are doing. And I would encourage you to keep the faith and keep the hope, one step in front of the next, one day at a time. All of us doing this together is what it's going to take.
Well, that was, Dr. Miner, that was, thank you. And Jennifer, thank you for that question. We're going to stop there. Next panel is, Thomas, I'll turn it over to you, but we'll be with Mariana Grossman and Dave Johnson to talk about systems thinking and rethinking. Dr. Miner, I think we've teed it up well. Now let's talk about big solutions to the gigaton challenges, scale challenges. Dr. Miner, that was fantastic. I have chills. Fantastic. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thomas?